This is TWiT.
I think it's a ridiculous thing that Slack is doing. Slack has announced it's filing a complaint against Microsoft in the EU because they don't like that Microsoft is, quote, tying Teams to Office 365. And they feel like that's blocking them from being chosen as a best of breeds technology versus Teams.
Stuart Butterfield of Slack has turned into the Scott McNealy of this century.
Oh my God. Not even Scott McNealy.
Worse. Except Scott McNealy was intelligent. Scott McNealy had some pretty good ideas about antitrust. I found myself agreeing with him on a lot of stuff. This guy comes off as a whiner.
Yeah.
It's like, please buy us, please buy us, please buy us. They're not competition. They're not competition. Right. They're not competition.
Yeah. Oh yeah, they are. We're filing an antitrust complaint.
And then he's like, "Oh my God, they're obsessed with us." And it's like they never even mention you. What are you talking about? You talk about Microsoft all the time.
Every day. I know. So in May, Stuart Butterfield, the CEO of Slack, said Microsoft's not even a competitor to Slack. But then if you look at their 10Q for Slack, they cite Microsoft as their main competitor, not just a competitor, right? So now they weren't a competitor, maybe they're a competitor, but now they're such a competitor, they have to go to the EU and try to get legal intervention against Microsoft. So I'm not saying this as somebody who loves Teams. In fact, I'm not a big Teams fan. Slack is okay, Teams is okay, but I just don't like the hypocrisy here.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, So I've always been bothered by his stance in particular, and I guess we'll just say Slack's stance in general. Yeah. I found it to be disingenuous all along. Yeah. That said, I mean, we live in an era now where big tech is being examined by antitrust regulators around the world, and I have myself, for example, complained a lot about Apple's business policies with regards to the App Store. It's not hard to complain about a company like Google or Facebook. Amazon is also in the mix. I mean, maybe with both the past in mind and what's happening to these other companies now, I thought it might be interesting just to kind of briefly discuss how this kind of lines up. Because when you think, like, the App Store to me is the best example of this kind of thing, because the App Store is a gateway to iOS that developers have to go through. They have no choice. There are fees that some say are onerous. I happen to agree that they are. We talked about that 30% thing versus like 3% for credit cards. But the central issue really is that they control some huge percentage of mobile by revenue, right? And they are the gatekeepers to this system. Microsoft and other companies can't speak directly to their own customers on the platform. It's a huge problem. And so I guess when I look at the Slack thing, I think, well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Office 365 or Microsoft 365 is fairly dominant. Microsoft doesn't have like a monopoly by any measure in the enterprise, but Microsoft is obviously well placed in the enterprise.
Yeah.
They are doing the product tying thing. I mean, they're not selling Teams as a standalone product. They are bundling it into absolutely fair to say. Yep. And you can think back, well, that's what they did with IE and Windows, right? Except that like Microsoft 365 isn't dominant in any way like Windows was. I mean, I think that's the problem. The other thing is the App Store comparison. Sorry, just real quick. I just want to say it's not the only way to reach those customers. Microsoft doesn't get 30% even if you try to bypass them. They don't get 30% if you go through them. They don't get any percent. It's not the same thing.
Yeah. The other part of this argument that I think Microsoft probably will make if they have to defend themselves in court, if the EU takes this up and decides to go forward. So Microsoft has 260 million paid seats of Office 365. They have 75 million active daily users of Teams. So those two numbers aren't exactly apples to apples, but if you kind of look at them that way, it means 1/3 of Office 365 users are using Teams and the other 2/3 are not, even though it's free to them.
The other thing to look at is how many Microsoft 365 customers are using Slack.
A lot. Even Slack brings that up, right?
It's probably pretty high.
Slack talks about that publicly, and they've actually put out press releases, I believe, about this saying, you know what, even though Microsoft gives away Teams, there's a lot of people who use Office 365 who use Slack. Okay, so you just made your point that people still are willing to pay.
This is Slack, where the phrase hoisted by your own petard comes into play, because I think Slack's public statements are ultimately going to be what comes back to haunt it.
I do too.
In 18 years, when the EU finally takes
Exactly.
some action on this.
Yeah.
I mean, it's going to happen slowly if it happens.
Yeah. So I don't have a problem with Slack. And you know what? They've decided, I guess, they can't compete without going the legal route. They've given up because 75 million active daily Teams users. The latest Slack number is 12.5 million simultaneously connected users. So obviously Microsoft has really bypassed them by a lot.
So that is an interesting point, because the other issue here is Slack a month ago had their financial results from the previous quarter. And one thing we learned is that they didn't grow exponentially like a lot of these other companies with messaging services. And investors were really disappointed by that. Yeah. And that, coupled with the news that, I guess we can't compete, we're going to have to file an antitrust complaint, might signal to potential customers, to potential investors, that this company is not going to make it. Like they may have kind of sealed the deal here themselves. I don't know what their original aim was. I don't know if they wanted Microsoft to buy them when that was a possibility. Remember, there were rumors to that effect.
I think they did. 2016.
Like $6 billion or something.
$8 billion.
$8 billion. Okay, yeah. Well, that's over one Nokia. So, I think Microsoft at that time was probably kind of burned by that. And I know they were swayed. I think Bill Gates and others had said, look, we could do this ourselves. Why are we spending money on this?
Right.
The other issue, and no offense to Slack, I mean, Slack is what it is. It's fine, and I will give them credit for being an innovator in this space, in the kind of chat-based collaboration field or whatever. Microsoft took about a year, I would say, since the first release of Teams to kind of get up to where Teams was. But in the couple of years since that, Teams has become an enormous platform. It become the next Outlook.
It has. Even more. It's become the next Windows, right?
Yeah,
it's like it's everything, right?
Yeah, it's literally a platform that runs apps. Yeah. And one of the reasons you don't like it, which is one of the reasons I'm starting to have problems with it, is if anything, it's getting too big for its own good. It's
exactly.
So much stuff going on. It's kind of hard to keep track of it. So Teams, I mean, I hate to say that Slack is right in this respect, but I mean, this is not what they meant. But in many ways, Slack and Teams don't compete anymore, because Teams does so much more than Slack does.
Yeah. Did you see Microsoft's response, by the way, to the complaint?
What did they say?
Here's a choice line from it. With COVID-19, the market has embraced Teams in record numbers, while Slack has suffered from its absence of video conferencing. So it's like,
I think that's related to what I said before. That was reflected in their financials. Right?
It was. Right.
I think because Zoom and Google and Microsoft, I mean, everyone who has any play in this field at all, so are not like, we know what happened to Teams. I mean, Teams has been almost exponential. Yeah. And that's the way it should be. I mean, we're all working from home.
So why doesn't Slack buy Zoom? Probably it's too expensive.
Wait a minute, I'm confused. Slack has video conferencing.
Yeah, but
we use it all the time.
So you can look this up. They actually came out sometime in the past month and said that video conferencing was not a priority for them. It was a kind of a sub-use, and they were not going to invest in it and didn't really care that much about it. And that, too, might be viewed as a statement of just like Microsoft is not a competitor. It's like, we're not particularly strong in this area. We don't see any way to make it better quickly. We're going to pretend it's not important. But Slack comes off very poorly between all of the public statements, especially from their CEO. The financials, like I said, from last month, and now this, it's like, we can't compete. And it's like, okay, you guys are all over the map.
I know.
I mean, I understand the frustration, because it is fair to say, I mean, Microsoft saw what they were doing, kind of balanced the two ways of going about it, and said, well, we're going to build the same thing. Yeah. Of course, Microsoft being Microsoft, they piled it on, and it's a much bigger thing now. But, they did go right after Slack. By the way, that's what companies do. They compete. It's not illegal to aggressively compete with a company.
Right. No, I remember one of Stuart Butterfield's claims was Microsoft is obsessed with us. Yeah, you know how Microsoft works? They zero in on something that's successful and growing, and they Yeah, they obliterate you. That's the way they work. Even with Satya Nadella at the helm. This is how this works.
Yeah.
This is business, right? I don't know. I'm not saying I think it's like amazing or a great strategy, but it's worked for Microsoft. That's why they grow.
They're like the yippy dog that's running around your legs and yipping and yipping and yipping, and eventually they're just going to punt you through the uprights. I mean,
yeah,
we've had enough.